Modern storytelling has an odd fascination with totalitarianism. Almost every dystopian novel, movie, or television show from 1984 to The Hunger Games features some kind of governing body that wants absolute control over its population, providing an easily identifiable bad guy for the audience to hate. But let's be honest, not all of them actually work. The trope of the all-powerful evil empire tends to be run-of-the-mill, more of a get-out excuse for an author to avoid having to create a nuanced and well-explored world. There's a lot of explanations for that, ranging from America's inherent dislike of any imperial control over their free will to bad feelings still floating around from the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But let's not get bogged down in details. We're not about understanding the origins of totalitarian literature, but rather how to do it well. So, totalitarianism. Let's talk. Blake 7 was a groundbreaking British science fiction television series produced by the British Broadcasting Corporation from the late 70s into the early 80s. Surrounded by pop culture sci-fi like Tom Baker's era of Doctor Who and Star Wars, Blake 7 stood out from the crowd with its darker, more realistic take on the future. Instead of being light and fluffy, Terry Nation's sci-fi epic delved deeply into the realms of the human psyche and how individuals were shaped after living their entire lives under the thumb of an oppressive government that could alter their memories at will. This was a show that said that man's greatest enemy wasn't bug-eyed alien monsters from outer space, but was, in fact, itself. Blake 7 opens with the story of one Raj Blake, a former rebel leader who had taken a stand against the corrupt Earth-based Federation. Now, as you might have guessed, the Federation didn't take very kindly to this, and wiped Blake's memory after forcing him to record a recantation of his ideology in a bid to end the rebellion. Blake ends up living his life for years without any knowledge of the past, only coming to terms with it after the rebels make contact with him once again. Blake is then hunted down by the Federation and its lackeys, barely managing to escape their grasp in time to return to his old life as a freedom fighter, striking out against the Federation once more in a stolen ship. Now, there are four major aspects of a successful and convincing totalitarian dictatorship that we can learn from Blake 7, especially its first episode, The Way Back. First, and kinda obviously, is that the government has to be oppressive. It can't be your run-of-the-mill corrupt democracy or even a benevolent autocracy, but instead has to concern itself with details of its citizens' lives that governments generally don't care about. The ubiquitous use of cameras and other recording devices serves as a quick visual clue to remind the audience that the government is always watching you. You have no privacy. You have no you time. The government is there every moment of every day in every single thing that you do. Similarly, offhand mentions of things that the audience would find terrifying, but which the characters think of as normal, add a layer of matter-of-fact reality. For example,
all our food and drink is treated with suppressants. Going without for a day and a half, they should be wearing off.
Not that again.
The government putting drugs in people's food and water to make them docile? That's chilling. Secondly, a well-constructed totalitarian dictatorship should be natural. Now, it's all too easy to create a caricature as your main villain, but a believably oppressive government will offer its people a carrot as well as a stick. It won't all be doom and gloom. There has to be a sense of safe normalcy that the oppressed populace has in order to stay in line. After all, they'll think, it could be worse. An effective dystopia is shown to have citizens enjoying themselves, within the confines placed on them, of course. Blake 7 does this fairly well, showing people living their lives outside of Blake's struggle for freedom. There's even this dude with his super fabulous, probably still Apple-made headset, jamming out to the hottest tunes of the future. Now, obviously, you're going to want to show the problems this dictatorship creates more, But you have to round that out with a naturally realistic world of normalcy that gives the characters incentive to stay under their tyrannical overlords. Thirdly, if you want to make your antagonist's tyranny really scary, you have to make them powerful. Now again, this sounds obvious. It's one of the first things you think of when you're thinking about a totalitarian dystopian dictatorship. Try saying that 3 times fast. But it's a lot harder to actually pull off than not. A good dystopian government is one that actually wins more often than it loses, at least until our heroes manage to build their strength up to challenge their enemies more effectively. You've got to remember that this is not a story about how these evildoers got into power, it's about what people do when all options are exhausted and the bad guys have already won. As cool as the Empire from Star Wars is, they do seem to lose quite a bit. Apart from the Battle of Hoth in Episode 5, they don't actually do much damage to the galaxy at large, which, at least to me, makes them a bit less imposing as a realistic oppressive force. If you want to craft a convincing, all-powerful totalitarian government, you've got to make sure that they actually do things that are terrifying. They can't just sit there and be beaten at every turn by your heroic rebel group. The Federation of Blake 7 is far more impressive in that regard, tramping in and gunning down rebel sympathizers without a second thought, for example. Oof. Their fascination with altering facts is also frighteningly compelling. This is a government that alters whatever they don't like, crafting a new reality that fits their purposes better than whatever actually has happened. For Blake, they initially covered over his memories and the parts of his mind that led him to a life of rebellion. But after his recapture, they turned instead to discrediting him with criminal accusations they produced out of thin air.
That's why you surprised me when you said you'd plead guilty.
But not to this, not to these charges.
Well, they are the only ones that have been brought against you. And I must tell you, frankly, the evidence against you is very damaging.
Well, if there is any evidence, it's been faked.
Even when one of the officials in charge of his investigation discovers that there's something fishy with the story and sets out to prove Blake's innocence, he and his lover end up gunned down in the mud while Blake is shipped off to a prison colony. The first episode of the series ends on a very bleak note, as it should, making sure that its audience understands the enveloping power and evil of the Federation. We end thinking that there is very little hope for our heroes, instead of being able to see them in action defeating the enemy. We end the first episode of the series having seen the Federation stamp out essentially every single avenue of resistance that Blake and his allies have tried to bring forward. These are not people you mess around with. These are people who will kill you and who will stop you no matter the cost. Fourthly and finally, a believable dystopian tyranny should be relatable. Just as it ought to be natural feeling, so too must it be based in something that the audience is familiar with. It's much harder for a Western audience to empathize with a dictatorship that came to power because of, say, food shortages or mass epidemics, for example, because those are problems that much of the Western world hasn't experienced, by and large, for a very long time. But on the other hand, telling your audience that the government began its reign of terror by promising to keep them safe from external threats, only to end up with a system that invades their privacy in the vain hope of rooting out any form of dissent, well, that is a bit more understandable. Blake's Federation is very much based on late 20th century fears of government overreach and the quest for a unified societal mind. The Federation won't tolerate dissent. It's always watching, and keeping its populace in line by using drugs. In essence, it is the ultimate end form of the boogeyman of Stalin-era Soviet Russia, combined with a more relatable Western aesthetic. The Federation then is terrifying because it wears the face of a common enemy, and says that, in fact, that enemy is really us. And that's what it really comes down to. A good dystopian story, featuring a believable totalitarian dictatorship, says more about the human condition than it does about anything else. The real enemies here are normal people, pushed to extremes for whatever reason you decide to come up with as an author. They're the real monsters. And that's what you gotta show.